Awesome. Beat me to it. Perfect. So just kind of jumping right in, this is the first workshop. It's the first outreach to stakeholders, to all of you. It will run through about noon today. There will be a number of different elements that we have throughout it that we'll go through here. So diving right in. First is an agenda. What you'll have noticed is we did issue an agenda on the IPA's website under the resource adequacy study. It should match this by and large. And really the goal today is to break it up into a series of different components. We'll spend just a few minutes up front here on some introductory slides. We'll then dive into the work plan overview, which is a large portion of this process with the E3 team going through that. Then we're going to have a series of smaller presentations by the ICC, IEPA, and the IPA myself, aligning really what we're doing cross agencies and the roles that we're playing in different initiatives that we have ongoing. Then about the last 30 minutes is going to be for a series of right now 3 questions that we have queued up. You'll also find those in the agenda. These questions are just a bit of a precursor to a larger series of questions that we're going to issue out, but we're going to slate 30 minutes to this. Given the large number of folks, there may be some challenges, I'll say, with getting through everyone, depending on the amount of involvement, but we'll do our best. The good news with this, as we'll talk about in a little bit, we will be issuing some additional questions and written follow-up, and all of the questions discussed today are part of that as well. So if you don't have a chance to go into the level of detail that you want, there will be plenty of time for you to provide feedback. All right, so first, just the introductory slides here. As always, there's this disclaimer. So, any statements made during the workshop are intended to provide stakeholders with just summary information of this process. The resulting efforts or activities may change over time. So this is our best effort at this point. The slide deck is for informational purposes only and isn't necessarily a representation of any legal interpretations or statements of policy by the agencies, the staff, or consultants. And any of the content presented herein or views or opinions expressed during the workshop do not represent any legal interpretation, statement of policies, or statement of fact by any of the agencies, staff, or consultants as well. So from a logistics standpoint, as you saw on the agenda slide, there's a lot that we have packed into today's workshop. It's really intended to inform all of you, as we'll get into. So with that in mind, we're asking that, to the best of your ability, you hold your questions till a later period in time. And if you do have one that is very specific, short, and technical in nature, that is, we have an acronym you don't understand, or there's a concept that maybe you don't quite understand, then please do utilize the raise hand feature, which should be, at least in mine, it's the bottom of the screen. There's a little button called raise hand. Please do that. I'll do my best as we go throughout here to call upon you. That said, I do ask that they're very kind of short and tactical in nature. If they're more kind of detailed questions asking for further follow-ups, if there's also things that could be like, new concepts, ideas, again, we're going to have stakeholder session at the end. There will also be that written comment period. There is also a section, as we said, for your input at the end of the workshop. There's further materials out on our website. So I avert to this first. There's currently an agenda. This presentation, as we kind of go through on here, will also be posted, as will the workshop recording. So we're recording this. We recognize that some folks may not be able to attend for the entire workshop, or may want to look at it later. There may be some that just couldn't attend. So we will be posting that. We'll do so as quickly as we can. It could take a day or so to get that up, but just check back and you'll see that on the website. And again, as I've kind of noted here, in addition to the questions asked in today's workshop, we'll be seeking some additional written responses, feedback on written responses. We'll discuss that at the very end of next steps. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here. But really, the intent is to better communicate with all of you going forward. So as part of that, we have also created on our webpage a email distribution list. I'd ask all of you to go out to the IPA's website. There's a resource adequacy tab under the very first energy procurement section. You can enter your name, your email. You'll be added automatically to a distribution list. That distribution list will then be used to communicate with all of you going forward for these materials, new questions that come out, upcoming workshops, and so on. So you don't always have to constantly go back and check the website. We will do our best to communicate out through that communication list. So to kick things off, before we kind of dive through some of the statutory requirements and then proceed through, I'd like to invite both the heads of each of the agencies here to give a kind of a few words as kind of a welcome and opening. So John Feipel, if you could start for us. Oh, John, you're on mute. Let's see. Let's do this. How about that? Still cannot hear. Greg Feipel.
You want me to go ahead and kick things off?
Yeah, we can hear you, Laura. So why don't you kick things off and We'll try to get John's microphone going.
Yep. Good morning, everyone. Laura Roach, Chief of Staff at Illinois EPA. Good to see a number of familiar names on the list as we kick off this work here. Thanks.
Do you want me to go ahead, Jim? And
keep that's better too.
There we go.
I can hear you now, John. Go ahead.
Very good. All right, and thank you everybody for being here and for participating this morning. I think just very quickly, lots of you have probably already heard me say this in different venues, but you know, you go back to 1997 when Illinois restructured electricity markets. This kind of planning is something that we haven't done for almost 30 years. I think when we take a step back here and we look at what CEJA gave us, a very specific timeline by which we can plan for and plan the development of resources to address potential resource adequacy shortcomings. So I think that's what you're going to hear from us a lot here. I think as Illinois tries to look into other tools to make sure that we're doing what we need to do. I think you're also going to hear that we're much less interested in like binary pass fails, as in planning and finding solutions for making sure all this works going forward. So with that, thanks for being here. And Brian, turn it back over to you.
Great. Thanks, Brian Granahan, Director of the Illinois Power Agency. Great to see so much interest in this workshop. For those who aren't familiar with the IPA, we were set up back in 2007 to develop procurement plans and conduct procurement events to meet the supply requirements of what are called eligible retail customers in Illinois. Those are customers that still take supply from the utility, their default supply customers. We have other responsibilities, including RPS implementation, nuclear plant support, implementing labor and equity policy, implementing consumer protection work. So we've grown a lot over the years as these responsibilities have changed. And I've been with the IPA since April of 2014. And as I'm sure John remembers well, back in the fall of 2014, I was trying to think of things that we've done that bear some similarity to this sort of report analysis. 4 state agencies were asked to put together a report under House Resolution 1146, asking ourselves questions about what the effect would be on metrics, including reliability and resource adequacy of at-risk nuclear plants leaving the market. So we did some modeling and did some work associated with that about 11 years ago. And then the most similar recent work that the IPA has done is the policy study that we put together, where we assessed 3 proposals on a variety of different qualitative metrics, including some quantitative analysis, and that itself included different forms of modeling to try to determine essentially what effects we would see on the market from these new market entrants facilitated through those policies. So we've examined some market exits, we've examined some market entrants, but what we haven't done to date is this sort of more holistic exercise of looking at the entirety of the market and making this type of assessment. So that's a bit new for the IPA, given our more narrow focus. But the great thing is that it's not new for our procurement planning consultant, E3, who has done integrated resource planning in other jurisdictions. So you'll be hearing a lot from E3 throughout this process. And you'll also be hearing a lot from our Planning and Procurement Bureau Chief, Jim Rowland, who's the host of this meeting. He'll be your point of contact for the Illinois Power Agency as we roll forward with this study. So that's it for me. I'll turn it back over to Jim.
Thanks, Brian, John, and Laura. All right, so kind of setting things off first. So the workshop intent. Really, this is intended to inform all of you as stakeholders of really our end-to-end process for the study. In addition to kind of going through all of that, there's questions we're going to be discussing in today's workshop. There's a series of additional written questions we're going to be asking. Really, the intent is to solicit information from you, but also provide you with some really solid information going forward. The focus of the questions even themselves focus around goals, scenarios, study approaches, data assumptions, all the inputs and considerations that we should be really considering going forward for the end-to-end process. I have a few items here that I think all of you should be able to leave with an understanding of at the end. Many of these deal with the process, deliverables, timings. It's the schedule. So beyond just the timing that's defined within statute, there are a series of different items. It's really the end-to-end schedule for the RA study that both I'll highlight, as well as Arnie from E3 in kind of a conceptual design here. There's also a series of key elements that I'd like all of you to be able to hopefully walk away with understanding from the foundational understanding of just RA study itself, the methodologies that we're using, the analytical frameworks and tools that we have, a suite of different items that you can kind of read here for. So from an agency perspective, we're here to inform. That's really what this is for. We will, as I've said multiple times here, have requests for additional feedback, and throughout the process we're going to have requests for feedback and information, both discreetly as well as in broad contexts. But I think it's really helpful to dive right into what the statute says. All of you can go out and read it. What I've done here is just briefly summarize, and you can see that it is targeted in its approach. So the intent here is first and foremost that we're going to evaluate in this process the renewable energy goals and requirements that we have, the status of CO2e and co-pollutant emission reductions. We'll understand and evaluate the current state and progress toward a suite of different topics. This one being, green hydrogen technologies. We'll also evaluate resource adequacy, which is of course the overall nature of this, but also the broader reliability questions that we have and we need to dig into. And at the end of all of this, the evaluation is also expected to include proposed solutions. So the study itself is intended to identify those challenges. And as you'll see in a slide here, there's also the next step, which is the plan to help solve them. What is also pretty explicit within the statutory requirements is the term that we're at least initially required to interrogate and investigate through. And that is a 5-year look ahead that's through 2030-31. As Arnie and the E3 team, though, will go through that, really an RA study or even integrated resource plans, which is a step beyond what this is, but has some key components to it, typically looks 5, 10, 15, 20 years out. So there are elements and additional considerations that we're going to have, but the statute itself defines that 5-year outlook as the period that we, at least at a minimum, need to be considering for the purposes of the requirement. And there's really an if-then statement that occurs within the statute itself. So in effect, if we evaluate a suite of different topics, everything from data and information that we get from the RTOs, the evaluation of renewable and other generating resources, that includes storage and includes demand response, pursuit of the CO2e and co-pollutant emission reductions that we also have. If we evaluate these and effectively find a shortfall, that is a shortfall in resource adequacy and the reliability standards that underpin it. This also includes some of these other items. So that includes whether there's sufficient in-state capacity to meet the zonal requirements, or if the RTO themselves determine there's a reliability violation somewhere. Then we have a very quick next step. And that next step is the second step, or the plan. And that plan is intended to consider a full suite of different options. And I've listed some of them here. There are more within the statute that you could build upon, evaluating renewable energy, generating resources that exist, the storage, demand response, transmission, potentially even adjusting the clean energy targets or emission standards, and many others. And the intent here is to really use all of the tools in the proverbial toolbox to consider what could be done to alleviate the shortfall that we defined and evaluated in the first if statement, if you will. So in effect, we're walking away and saying, if we find a shortfall, the agencies will develop a plan. And that's really what we're driving towards out of the study. The evaluation is the RA study is the evaluation. The plan is the next step. So that's where on here from a schedule, if you look just at the statute and say, what does it say over what period of time? We're looking at this very first spot. And that first spot is here in red. We have that 5-year cadence. So this is the first of what will be many successive hereafter. Starting in 2025, the report's going to be issued by December 15th of each year. So the first one, December 15th of 2025. This is the RA study period that we're going to be discussing throughout the day today or the morning. The plan is the big next step. So if we find a shortfall and challenges, then we're developing a plan thereafter. And there's a series of different steps here over different time periods that we'll be also evaluating. That said, we're not going to be focusing much on the plan because the plan is subject to the shortfall determination in this study. But I also wanted to highlight for all of you again what the collaboration looks like. So again, the statute is pretty clear in certain respects, but we're going to go a little bit above and beyond with that. So from a consultation perspective, it informs us that we need to go out as the agencies to collaborate with and solicit some consultation from the RTOs, that is PJM Interconnection and MISO. We'll be looking for all sorts of different information, but that includes some of their information, their own studies and evaluations, the status of generating resources, new and evolving transmission development through their planning processes, as well as just any other large generating resource closures or retirements that are upcoming. Again, the second part here for the stakeholder input is actually in respect to the plan. So that'll come at a later period. But in the bottom, we have the items that both include where we're at today and going to be going forward with stakeholder collaboration. And that is this first workshop. So this is the kickoff. We're going to immediately have written feedback on questions within the next day or two that we'll be issuing out to all of you. There's also going to be future workshops, at least one that we'd expect roughly, as you'll see in the next timeline, probably sometime in September, but it's subject to modeling results being available and issuing that out in a reasonable time for all of you to kind of review and then participate. And there's likely going to be written feedback requests through that process as well. Again, closer to the end of the process, but we're not talking November, it's September, maybe early October at the latest. So from an end-to-end schedule, this is what the RA study process right now looks like. Some key milestones, a couple flags. This will build out going forward. There's a version of this on the IPA RA study website as well. Right now, again, I have for September as a likely stakeholder workshop. Again, we'll provide more information going forward as we get closer to that date and evaluation of the results comes out. But really, we're driving toward that very end date of December 15th for the publication of this study itself. You can also see at the bottom some overlaying items. We have research, modeling, analysis really going on throughout the entire process. Sensitivities closer to the end, data collection up front, and then a report drafting that'll start probably right at the end of September through right up through the December filing date or submission date. So with that, that's just your broad overview here of end-to-end process, timing considerations, what we're required to do in statute. But I want to actually spend most of the time here on the work plan overview and actually hand it off to Arnie and his team at E3 to dive through. So Arnie.
Okay, great. Yep. Thanks, Jim. My name is Arnie Olson. I'm a senior partner with E3. I'm thrilled to be joining you today to talk about the resource adequacy study in Illinois. I'll be joined by Nate Miller, who's the director at E3, and Charlie Duff, who is the project manager. So my role as senior partner is I lead our integrated system planning practice and have worked with a variety of utilities across North America on integrated resource planning. As Brian noted earlier, E3 is pretty familiar in this role, both in terms of consulting with state agencies on resource plans and resource adequacy, but then also with respect to resource adequacy in the industry. And so just briefly, if you don't really know much about E3, we've had somewhat similar roles for other state agencies in states that also had restructured and also hadn't done resource planning for a long time. So starting with our roots in California, where we support the Air Resources Board in its implementation of AB 32, which is the California Cap and Trade Program, as well as supporting the Public Utilities Commission there, which leads the state's integrated resource planning process, which started up in about 2017. And again, it had been 25 years since California had done any resource planning. And then similar roles in New York, doing modeling for NYSERDA, for the state's Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the New Jersey's Energy Master Plan, and some similar work in Massachusetts for the Department of Energy Resources. And then I'll note with respect to resource adequacy, we do loss of load studies and planning reserve margin studies for utilities across North America for their IRPs, but then also have advised both PJM and MISO in their capacity market reforms, particularly in the area of resource accreditation, which I'll get into in a little bit of detail later on. So just a little bit of background about E3. We're thrilled to be working with IPA here. I've been in this role for about 8 months and really, really enjoying it. So thank you for having us here. And if you go to the next slide. So we're gonna try to stay at the surface of this topic. It's really deep, it's really technical. We're not gonna get into too much technical detail. We're happy to do so in follow-up or emails or answer questions. We'll start at the high level. And so what's the first high level question is, what really is resource adequacy? We've put the NERC definition up there. You know, it's really just the ability of all of the resources in your portfolio to meet all electric demand across a wide range of conditions that might cause supply to be low or demand to be high. And those can include summertime heat waves, wintertime cold snaps, periods of significant amounts of generator outages. You know, you'd like your system to be planned to be very, very reliable. Of course, no system can be perfectly reliable, or it would be infinitely costly to do so. So every standard has, or every region has a loss of load standard. The most commonly used standard is 1 day in 10 years. So about once every 10 years, you might get into a situation where you don't have enough supply and you might need to do a shed load through rotating blackouts. That's the standard. The reality is, of course, much complicated and messier than that. But that's the general idea. And I'll note that, you know, the resource adequacy is really an investment question. It's the question of, are there enough resources to meet our load across a wide range of conditions? The solutions are all very capital intensive. And so even though the statute only has a 5-year look ahead formally, you really can't understand this question of resource adequacy without looking out at least over the lifetime of the investments that you might make in response to a resource adequacy issue. So this is why a long-term study is really important here. And again, E3 has a lot of experience performing these types of studies for similar states. So if we go to the next slide. Illinois, as was mentioned, is a restructured market. It sits inside of 2 different wholesale electricity markets. I think that's commonly understood, but it's important to focus on what the roles of the various entities are within this structure. So really, it's the markets, it's MISO and PJM that establish the loss of load standard, establish the need, allocate that need to the various LSEs within their market footprints, and establish the accreditation procedures that tell you what each of your resources can contribute toward that broader resource adequacy need. So this really has become a regionalized look at resource adequacy, and Illinois is in a bit of a unique position that there are 2 different regional resource adequacy constructs that it participates in. That doesn't mean that the state has no role at all. The state has both the ability to contribute to the process at MISO and at PJM through the regional estates committees. It also has a formal role in regulating how LSEs within its state can meet their obligations to these regional markets. So direct role in regulating and designing policy around the procurement of resources, as long as the resources that they procure will meet their obligations to these regional entities. So this membership in a regional market is beneficial to states that are members, in the sense that if Illinois does nothing at all and has no resources, and the market can provide enough resources to meet its resource adequacy needs, then that's great. That's the benefit of being in the market. The flip side of that is, even if Illinois were long on resources, had way more resources than it needed for its own loads, and the market was suffering a shortfall, there's a good chance that Illinois might also be subject to rotating blackouts. So you really have to understand, to answer the question about is Illinois resource adequate, we have to look at, is MISO resource adequate in its northern zones, and is PJM resource adequate within its western zones? And then the question becomes, what is Illinois' obligation to those markets on behalf of its loads, and what implications does that have through market outcomes for its customers, given its restructured nature? So those are all the levels of complexity that will go into this study. If you go to the next slide, we just got a little bit of information about the markets and how they structure their resource adequacy programs. PJM and MISO both have capacity auctions. PJM's is called the reliability pricing model. It's a mandatory 3-year forward auction. MISO is called the planning resource auction. It's more of a residual auction, in the sense that most of the entities within MISO are vertically integrated and not restructured. So I would say the importance of the auction itself is a little bit different in each of the markets. In PJM, it really is the primary signal for investment in new resources and retention of existing resources, because many of the resources that are owned, most of them across the market footprint, are owned by independent entities and not by state regulated utilities. In MISO, it's a bit of the opposite. Illinois, I think, is the only state that's fully restructured within MISO. But both of them, you can think of them both as playing a similar role broadly, which is to establish the regional need, establish the analytics around determining regional need, allocating need to LSEs, again, doing the accreditation and ensuring that the whole system is going to be resource adequate going forward. You can move to the next slide, please. Just quickly with respect to PJM, a little bit more detail. Again, it's a 3-year forward auction in PJM. So the idea originally there was that 3 years would be enough time to bring new capacity into the market. So you could bid your project into this 3-year forward auction, and if you're selected, then you can take all the next steps to move ahead with your project. I think with it's increasingly the case that 3 years isn't enough to bring a new resource into the market. And so really what this is starting to look more like, which is what MISO does and others, is just that price signal that is persistent and provides additional revenue for a generator beyond what it can earn in the energy and ancillary services markets, which is just a way to ensure that new resources can meet their financial hurdles. I know that PJM also has had some struggles keeping to their 3-year schedule, just given some of this restructuring that's been happening with respect to their capacity market, and which is also common in the other markets across the country, which we can talk about in a little bit. The other point about PJM is that, like MISO, they have zonal different zones that can separate if there's transmission congestion between them during the forward auction process. If there's no congestion during that process, then the market's all clear at the same price. But if there is congestion, then one zone might be higher than another. And you see what happened there on the right in 25 and 26 in PJM. If you go to the next slide, again, MISO has a relatively similar process, also has different zones. The zones can separate if there is transmission congestion. MISO has moved from more of a forward look to a seasonal look with respect to resource adequacy. So they now clear 4 seasons separately: summer, fall, winter, spring. You can see the prices there on the right during the most recent auction this summertime. Looks like it was the most binding period, and with winter and spring and fall being much less binding, perhaps not surprisingly, given the nature of the loads and resources in the region. although we are seeing wintertime becoming an increasing challenge and increasing focus of attention. Go to the next slide. Broadly, I wanted to just give you a little bit of background on some of the issues that the markets are addressing and dealing with respect to their resource adequacy constructs. There really are a handful of things that have caused, some restructuring within the markets, caused them to re-examine various aspects of their analytics that determine the market outcomes. There's been a lot of attention paid to that restructuring, and rightly so. These are very important markets. There's a lot of money at stake. Resource adequacy is a critically important topic, and so it's right, and people should be focused on how the markets are doing that. There should be a full discussion around that, but it is highly technical, and so it's important for folks to be as up to speed as possible as to the various things that are happening. At a high level, what we see is the changing in the nature of critical hours, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail on the next slide. But we're seeing that, especially as more and more resources of a particular type are added that has a particular limitation, and solar is the easiest example to think of. That's the one on the top left there. The more solar you add, the more energy you have available during daylight hours. And if the rest of the system is adjusting, then the critical hours, or the hours in which you might experience loss of load, tend to shift into the evening after the sun goes down, when that solar energy goes away. So generally, we're seeing a shifting from focusing on the peak load, which was almost always the time in the past when you might expect to potentially not have enough resources to serve load, to what we call the critical periods, which could happen really any time of the year. And so the question becomes, when do those critical hours happen? And how do resources perform during those critical hours? And that's the focus now on, with respect to the market's accreditation and need determination. We also see diminishing returns for certain types of resources, solar, wind, and batteries in particular, because they have limitations in their ability to be able to dispatch and generate when you might need them. And those limitations become more and more binding, more and more limiting, as you have more and more of those resources on the system. And that's really the flip side of the critical hour shifting point. So that just adds another layer of complexity to the market structures and to the analytics that market participants need to do and understand as they're evaluating the benefits and the value of their specific resources. And then we're also seeing a big focus on wintertime performance. Winter Storm Uri, Winter Storm Elliott, and some of the correlated outages that we saw where a lot of thermal resources were offline. There are potential problems with fuel supply. This was more the case across the southern part of the country, but we're seeing an increased focus and concern about this everywhere. So all of these things have really caused the markets to want to sharpen their pencils around, well, how reliable is our system? How do each of these individual resources contribute to it to ensure that the market signals that they send through the auction, the capacity auctions, are really sending the right signal about the value of different resources? And it's not listed here, but I think it's also important to understand that the background for all this, or the subtext, is just increasing tightness in terms of load resource balance. So we really are seeing, with retirements of firm resources throughout the country, and now increasing load and load growth, typically from data centers, industrialization. We're now seeing a period where we've had a period of capacity surplus for quite some time, and we're kind of coming to the end of that. So just the tightening of the markets is a theme we're seeing really everywhere across the country, and that by itself is going to lead to higher prices and more focus on the capacity auction, even if there weren't these other sort of technical issues happening as we describe on the slide here. Go to the next slide. The gold standard in analytics for resource adequacy is loss of load probability modeling. I feel like this is a topic in which there really isn't as much knowledge and sophistication in the industry as there should be. I think a lot of people understand production simulation and its impact, like the hourly energy prices. People have a sense of how those are determined. I don't think enough people really know the details of loss of load probability modeling, and so there's a little bit of education here. Generally, you could think of it as an organized way to analyze the potential for all the kinds of things that can happen to cause your system to perhaps not have enough supply to serve the load. And particularly all the various weather conditions that can happen. There's a very robust statistical analysis that's underneath the hood that goes back over all of the recent, a number of recent years in terms of weather patterns. How hot does it get? How hot is it likely to get in the future? What is the pattern of that heat event? Is it a 1 day, 2 day, 3 day event? What is the pattern of a cold weather event? And what are the correlations between the weather conditions that might drive high load and the conditions that might drive low generator availability? And again, whether that's a weather dependent resource outage rate, if resources are more likely to be out of service during very cold or very hot weather events, that's important to consider. If there are correlations or anti-correlations among solar, wind, and load, that's also important to consider. So really, it's a big statistical Monte Carlo analysis where you do a bunch of simulations across many years, and you count up the number of times that your system wasn't adequate, and you try to tune the system to meet that 1 day in 10-year standard. And now I'll just note that from that standard then comes a total need, and that need is used to derive a planning reserve margin, and the planning reserve margin then becomes what a lot of people focus on. So if you go to the next slide. This is really just a graphic to help illustrate this shifting critical hours. So the left-hand side is a daily load shape where the highest load is in the middle of the afternoon. This is kind of a typical summer peaking load shape. And in the past, that peak load in the middle of the afternoon would have been the time when we expected to have the highest probability of loss of load. On the right-hand side, you can see what happens when you add a lot of solar into the system. And this is exactly where California is today. We have 40 gigawatts of solar in California on a 52 gigawatt system. And all of the concern in California now is what happens after sundown between 6 and 10 p.m. and particularly in September and October when the sun sets earlier and there's less solar available for charging. So this is just an example of how the focus is shifting from the peak period to the period with both a combination of high load and low supply. Go to the next slide. So I mentioned that both PJM and MISO have been responding to these changes in the resource fundamentals through tweaks to their capacity auctions and their accreditation processes. And we're seeing the results of these in the most recent auction in PJM, and we will see them in future MISO auctions. So both MISO and PJM have had their new accreditation methodologies approved by FERC. The New York ISO has also gone through this process, and they all are moving toward what we call a marginal ELCC, or effective load carrying capability approach, which you should really think of this as a focus on those critical hours. It's no longer just focused on the peak. It's now focused on what are the hours in which we might expect to have loss of load and how do resources perform during those hours. In MISO, it's called the direct loss of load framework. PJM just calls it marginal ELCC. But in effect, it's both processes are very similar, again, just focused on those critical hours. And so when E3 does its modeling, which I'm going to turn this over to Nate Miller, and he'll walk through our modeling process and the timeline. But in effect, we'll be using the same approach with our own model as we look into the future for Illinois. Go to the next slide. Okay, this is where I'm going to turn it over to Nate to kind of walk you through some of the details and nuts and bolts of the study process. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Arnie. So let's go to the next slide here, Jim. So I'm going to start off by connecting the dots a bit with the overview and purpose of the study that Jim was providing to the key topics and resource adequacy, and then take you into the specific models and methodologies that we'll be employing in this study. So starting off, sort of a restatement and sharpening our pencils here on the goals of the resource adequacy study. So as Jim mentioned, as defined in statute, the first objective is to identify whether there is going to be a resource adequacy shortfall within the 5-year forecast period to 2030, 2031. That includes an assessment of how reliable the system is today. You need to start with a benchmark in order to understand how the system will evolve and what the evolution of that system looks like. And then second, We will have a second portion of the study once a resource adequacy shortfall or lack thereof has been determined. We need to understand and develop an action plan to address the shortfall. And we have essentially 4 steps here. First, 4 individual objectives. We are really framing this as a study in service of policy for the state of Illinois. So as we've been discussing, because Illinois exists as part of 2 broader markets and regional transmission operators that are responsible for the reliability of the system, the objective of this study is to understand whether the policy direction and specific objectives as defined by Illinois will have an impact on resource adequacy. And if so, what additional policy options could Illinois employ to address them? So it's really defined and designed to be not a direct addendum or revision or suggestion to how PJM or MISO do their capacity accreditation and capacity auction frameworks, but as a policymaking and information tool first and foremost. So I think we can go on to the next slide and we'll talk a little bit more about the structure of the models in the next couple. So, as this probably surprises no one, looking at a model workflow, you start with inputs, you do some modeling, and you get results. And I want to tick through some of those and then talk more specifically about the interactions of the tools that we have. So on the inputs, what kinds of data need to go into a resource adequacy assessment? You need to have a load forecast. You need to have a load profile down to an hourly shape of that load. That is necessary because that hourly shape then needs to be evaluated against a number of different weather conditions to get the Monte Carlo simulation for the loss of load probability and expectation. We need to understand what new resources are available for the system to be added over the model horizon and what the cost of those resources are. As Arnie mentioned, this is about an investment question. So we need to understand the costs for the model logic to optimize those. We also need to understand the operational characteristics of those new resources. If we're talking about wind and solar, what kind of a 8760 hourly generation profile? If we're talking about storage, what kind of round trip efficiency, charge and discharge profile and duration are available to those options? Talking about thermal resources, existing and new candidates, we have to understand their operational characteristics in terms of the fuel supply availability, outage rates, seasonal capacity, net output by plant, all of those things. And then, of course, we have transmission assumptions, and we have to understand fuel prices in the market. So all of that data goes into models, and the 2 models principally that we'll be using are going to be a reliability model, just the loss of load probability tool, and a portfolio model, a resource model, which we're going to be using Plexo. So I'll talk about that more in a moment. And then the kinds of results that we'll get from that modeling exercise is first going to be the loss of load expectation. What is the expected unserved energy in the system? How many hours, how many days per year against that 1 in 10, 1 day in 10 years standard do we expect the system to have a loss of load event, insufficient generation to meet loads? We can then also understand what the contribution against the simulated range of outcomes is that each different resource contributes towards system reliability. In other words, the effective firm megawatts or resource adequacy contributions from different resource types. And that helps then inform the portfolio selection, the different investment costs to build a resource portfolio where the contribution sum of all the resources is adequate to meet the expected range of loads and generation. Let's go to the next slide here, Jen. Okay, so taking this a step further, as Arnie mentioned, we could talk for hours on this topic. It's quite technical and goes very deep, but wanted to provide at least kind of the call it the workflow of what the models are going to be doing and how we're going to be using them. So we start off with the inputs on the left-hand side, and what you see here are just the representation of the reliability model and the portfolio model. And the key dynamic is we start off with the reliability model, we look at the portfolios, resource options, and then we check the reliability afterwards. So specifically, we're going to be using the reliability model called RECAP, which is an in-house model developed by E3. It's been used extensively for the last decade across many integrated resource planning jurisdictions for utility plans, and it's also been used to inform market design and reform work that we've done for the RTOs themselves. So it's a widely used standard model. It is our own in-house tool, but it also works the same way as a number of other tools that are out there that do this analysis. The portfolio model that we're going to be using is Plexos. Plexos is a piece of commercial modeling software produced by Energy Exemplar. It's also very widely used in the energy industry. It has a couple different functions. Has a capacity expansion function, which chooses an optimal mix of resources to build, and then a production cost function, which dispatches the system on an hourly or sub-hourly level for certain portfolios. So the key mechanic here is first we start off with running our reliability model for the system today. And that's critical to understand, is the system reliable today? And by reliable, we mean what is the expected unserved energy and the probability of a loss of load event in the system today? Is it higher than the 1 in 10 standard or below the 1 in 10 standard? Then we look at retirements from the system and additions to the system and load growth over the next 5 years under a couple of different scenarios. I'll talk about those in a few minutes. And we use our Plexos model to choose a mix of resource additions to the system as units are retired. And then what we do is we check in those future portfolios, are those portfolios still meeting the reliability standard? So the first model, the system today, is going to help us understand the effective load carrying capability. In other words, the reliability contribution from different resource types at the margin. So if you add a little bit more solar today, how much more reliable is your system? If you add a bit more storage today, how much more reliable is your system? Then you use that calibration from today's system to assess what you should be adding to optimize your cost, to lower your investment cost and still meet the target. But then once you add those resources, you simulate that future load and resource mix to check if your portfolio is in fact as reliable as you are targeting. So it's a bit of an iterative process between these, the loss of load modeling, the capacity expansion, and the check of that future portfolio. So the next slide, Jim. Was that a question from the audience or? Okay, I'll carry forward. So this is just a bit of an overview of E3's recap model. As Arnie was explaining, I won't restate everything that he's been saying here, but add a little bit more color to it. So you start off with an understanding of today's load shape. So we could look at 2024, 8760 hourly loads in Illinois at a granular level in different transmission zones, as well as the hourly loads in the rest of the markets, because as Arnie was saying, Illinois does not exist in a vacuum. Illinois itself may be reliable, but if the rest of the market is not reliable, Illinois is still subject to the same loss of load issues that the system as a whole. In other words, we're all in the same boat. And so you have to look at how the boat itself is sailing and doing. So the simulation of those loads, you take the hourly load shape, and we have to then allow that shape through mapped correlations with different weather conditions and different renewable generation conditions for that weather matching across thousands of simulations of those weather years. And that allows us to understand a probabilistic distribution of how the available generation intersects with the load requirements. And where load is very high and generation is very low, those are the critical hours that we are really honing in on as part of this model framework. We can often present those critical hours in a month by hour table, as you see to the top right. So this will be sort of one of the standard kinds of outputs that the model produces, where by month for a single year, so January to December, hours of the day 1 to 24, we're highlighting what hours are the critical peak hours that should be the focus of your expected unserved energy and your reliability risk. And then the bottom right is a single axis ELCC penetration chart. So essentially, this maps and tracks from the model as you add more megawatts of a particular resource to the system for a given portfolio for a single year, what is the marginal contribution towards reliability of that megawatt? So what you're seeing is, in this particular example, when you have, 10,000 megawatts of solar added, that 10,000th megawatt of solar is about 30% per megawatt, or 0.3 megawatts contribution to the system's reliability. And so we use those single dimensional ELCC trajectories to allow the model, the Plexos model, to choose a mix of resources based on their marginal contributions to reliability over time. So the next slide, we'll talk about Plexos for a minute. All right. So Plexos, as I mentioned, again, uses linear optimization to optimize costs relative to constraints. It's an investment model in its LT, or long-term function. And then, as I mentioned, it can also then take that future portfolio that is selected and dispatch those resources against an hourly load to understand what the cost of that future system looks like. So we're going to be primarily using Plexos for its capacity expansion, its ability to select resources to meet certain constraints. So those constraints can include what is the target renewable portfolio standard, the amount of generation from designated eligible resources that must be met in a given system. And a secondary and additional constraint is the reliability need. What is the total sum of megawatts at an accreditation, or ELCC value, and a planning reserve margin for a future year that is designed to achieve the target reliability standard. In other words, the loss of load probability tool helps generate what that reliability standard is and the contribution from each resource. And then the optimization model will select the least cost in mix of resources that altogether will meet that standard as one of its constraints. So obviously, a very critical input into this capacity expansion model is what resources are available, what are their characteristics, and what are their costs. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about how we are planning the topology, or the sort of general structure of our capacity expansion and loss of load probability models for this study. So you can see in the middle here, Illinois is right at this intersection of two major markets, two regional transmission operators in North America. We have PJM to the east, and we have MISO to the north and west. And so within Illinois, we plan to model the broader systems as well, because we have to understand not just what's happening within Illinois, but the Illinois and its transmission import and export capabilities to neighboring zones, and then more broadly, what's happening in the rest of the market. Because as I said, Illinois is really in two different boats and will need to rise and fall with the reliability of those two systems. So MISO South here is going to be modeled as net imports to the system. That we believe is a helpful simplification of the model. The last auction, MISO South is a relatively limited transmission path to the rest of MISO, and there's about 2 gigawatts of imports that were contracted and participating from south to north in the last capacity auction. So we're going to be assessing the availability of MISO South to deliver energy to rest of system as part of our topology. But then we're going to be focusing on MISO North and PJM West and East as two different zones. Within PJM, we want to reflect a transmission constraint between the far eastern reaches of PJM and the general western areas of the footprint. If you're familiar with PJM, the EMAC zone is that Eastern Capacity Market Zone, has in the past typically held a premium to RTO, or rest of the market. And that's largely because of this east-west transmission constraint. So we want to make sure we capture that in our modeling. And then, of course, we're going to be capturing the different interconnection points between the ComEd and Ameren service territories to the different market zones for the sake of resource selection and the reliability testing, so that we can better understand and model, as these two market operators do, the availability of generation flows during times of critical reliability hours to and from Illinois and the rest of these markets. So let's go to the next slide. Okay, so I want to talk for a few minutes about how we're thinking about scenarios and scenario development. There are a lot of elements of uncertainty in today's outlook, as there always are, but I feel it's no surprise there may be a few more variables today that we need to consider. So let's go to the next slide and we'll talk about how we're thinking about them. So we can categorize, we've done a lot of scenario analyses in our work. It's really hard to, I think, do this kind of study with a straight face without doing scenarios, because you need to understand cause and effect and map a range of different outcomes. We think about those in terms of two general categories. So one is a suite of external forces, forces that the state of Illinois does not really have any control over, and some policy decisions that the state of Illinois does have control over. That includes existing policies, but also how those policies are implemented and interpreted. So from external forces, we're talking about things like load growth, how much data center load and other loads are coming online, where are they coming online into the system, what kind of EV loads are coming on, and population growth and sort of macro factors across your core customer classes. All of those play into our load forecast. How are PJM and MISO actually accrediting their resources? As we mentioned, we're going to be aligning our methodology with what is being used by those two markets, so that we are fundamentally aligned with how resources are counted, but we will need to get gory with the details, and also then map and take into account what kinds of transmission upgrades and plans are being done in those markets, as they could influence the reliability result. And then, of course, another large external factor that we need to be considering is technology availability. What kinds of resources are available to the system in the short, medium, and long term? What is the cost of those resources? And what are the operational characteristics of those resources that we should feed to the model framework? Within the policy decisions, there are a number of different core concepts that need to be thought through and just integrated for this study. That includes things like resource-specific mandates, REC and ZEC incentives, how generators and policy goals will be monitored, enforced, counted. So we want to make sure that what we represent in our framework is consistent with the way the state of Illinois is approaching these questions. That's why we have a good, robust group of Illinois public policy stakeholders running this study. And then on the risk management side, reliability and resource adequacy, there's never one answer. There is always an answer that is contingent upon what the risk tolerance is of the policymakers. No system is 100% reliable. There's always a risk. So characterizing the nature of that risk, the cost of that risk, and what kind of a strategy and judgment from policymakers is going to be implemented and borne out in decisions. So next slide. We plan to frame up these two different categories of external and policy forces in scenarios along two axes. So thinking about them in terms of combinations of external forces and policy choices, so that for every set of policy decisions, characteristics, and goals, we can test how those goals play out and what the implications of those goals are for a certain set of external forces. High load growth from data centers, high retirements of thermal and the rest of the footprint of MISO or PJM, or high availability of maybe battery storage costs have a low cost trajectory and a mid cost trajectory. We need to understand these different potential future scenarios and map them together to create sort of a matrix of outcomes. And we think that'll be a useful conceptual framework to test different scenarios and how different policies play out in those scenarios, and ultimately come up with a holistic state of the landscape to inform the end conclusions of the study. The next slide. So I know Jim touched on this, but I just wanted to kind of restate here what our total timeline is. So we're obviously, midway through June right now. So we are really deep into the study design, standing up our models, and refining all of the structure of those tools. In this month and next month through July, we will be developing all of the inputs, starting off with some initial inputs to calibrate the tools and then refining those, through additional data requests with partners and other stakeholders. Through July and October, so summer to fall, we'll be running all the models and generating our results. So that will follow that original model framework. First, test the reliability of the system today, understand marginal contributions from different resources, turn out the portfolios of resource additions for scenarios, and then check the reliability of those future portfolios. And that will allow us to create a draft conclusions later this year. And that should put us on target for a November draft report and a December 15th final report release. So I think that's all I've got for now, Jim, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Nate and Arnie, for the presentation on the overview here of the process, the methodology that we'll be pursuing. So the next part of the workshop here is really an alignment of the different agencies' roles, responsibilities, and contributions. It is a high-level overview, but at least it'll start to kind of peel under the surface here of what we do, what we can do, the kind of opportunities that we provide to this RA study process. So the first thing before we dive in for each agency here is a setting of the land here. So first and foremost, from a cross-agency collaborative standpoint, we each have different opportunities, roles, and contributions that we can and do play. And it's really the bringing together of each of these important and unique suite of capabilities that underpins the function and the outcome that we're driving for in the RA study. I have a few highlighted here. I'm sure if we thought a little bit longer, we could come up with an even longer list, but they're everything from systems plannings and the cost considerations, generation resources, both how those integrate and interconnect to the system, procurements associated with them, broader procurement methodologies, environmental considerations, that of emissions, as well as the clean energy and permitting requirements and so on. And it's really combining all of these together and utilizing these capabilities in a focused effect in conjunction with the capabilities, as you've heard from E3 and other consultants that we may have, to create the balance that's needed for the study. Any one of us individually has strengths, but there's also some weaknesses, as you can start to see what our jurisdiction purviews are, capabilities are, experiences are. And so it's really this combination effort that's achieving the best and most optimal outcome that we have. And it's through this that we're driving toward that end state goal of this entire process, the reliability, resiliency, and the clean energy drive for our state policies. And so it's really with that, what we're going to do here is have short presentations by each of the agencies, and we're actually going to start with the ICC, Jim Zolniak and Torsten Clausen. Jim.
Thanks, Jim. And good afternoon or good morning, depending on which time zone you're in. I'm Jim Zolniak. I'm with the staff of the Illinois Commerce Commission. I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's going on in relation to this study at the commission. Obviously, this is a very dynamic environment, so we're not looking at static situations. Things are happening related to resource adequacy in many different activities throughout the commission, and I'll talk a little bit about those. Next slide, Jim. So the first one I want to highlight is the Renewable Energy Access Plan. As E3 and Jim have talked about, we're looking at resources and capacity and the ability to meet our load needs over time. But obviously, an integral part of that is having the transmission necessary to get generation assets and deliver those to the load centers. And that's what this Renewable Energy Access Plan is really focused on. It's focused on transmission. We're looking for zones in the state that are suitable for renewable energy. And then we're looking at plans for how do we get the resources that may develop in those zones to the load centers. The commission has been through the first round of the Renewable Energy Access Transmission Planning already. I posted a link to the very first plan, but this is a dynamic plan which will be updated every 2 years. We're currently in the midst of developing our second plan. Staff will develop a straw man, submit it to the commission by the end of the year, and then the commission will open a docket to consider this second plan. Obviously, this is very complementary to what we're doing in this resource adequacy study. And in some cases, even though there are some differences, it's more focused on transmission, is some overlap. Commission asked us to look at tracking progress towards CGIS goals and conduct a study to understand, what needs to be done to reach CGIS goals. And those are, very on point for the resource adequacy study as well. And just want to note that our friends at E3 are also helping us with this study as well. Next slide. In addition to activity directly at the commission, we've reached out to the national labs who are funded through Department of Energy for some help with various things. And we're getting tremendous support from the labs, really appreciate it. One of the things the national labs have agreed to help us with is capacity modeling. So NREL, the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, has undertaken to help us with capacity modeling. They are developing a model for Illinois, the Sienna model, which will consist of a nodal production model combined with power flow studies to look at some of the same things that E3 is going to be looking at, understanding the impact of retirements of fossil fuel generation resources, assessing the adequacy and reliability of Illinois' energy resources, integrating the modeling into those policy recommendations, ensuring our agencies have the tools we need to undertake these analysis. So this is very complementary to what we're doing in the study, and we're hoping the results can also feed in and support the work we're doing here. Next slide, please. Then we're getting support from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. They're helping us better understand load forecasting and some of the tools we could use to do better load forecasts as we deal with not only traditional loads and development over time, but ever increasing large load situations such as those associated with data centers. So we will be getting support from Lawrence Berkeley on that. Next slide. And then finally, Pacific Northwest National Lab is helping on a couple of, again, closely related things. Battery storage. We've had energy storage procurement workshop series that just recently concluded. And to further that work, Pacific Northwest National Laboratory is going to help us look again at the markets, look at our capacity needs, and figure out, what exactly do we need in the way of battery resources. To continue to help supplement some of the previous work that's been done in this area by the IPA and others in the state. And finally, PNNL is also going to help us with some GIS modeling, and in particular, those renewable resource zones. We proposed some of those and the commission adopted them in our first renewable energy access plan. But there's a desire to get a little more granular, be a little more precise with some of those boundaries and some of the situations on the ground that led to the creation of those zones. So they're going to help us with some GIS modeling to get there so we can be more granular. Next slide. There are also several things that are kind of feeding in. You can think of them as maybe supply side efforts, but that are definitely correlated with, again, resource adequacy and the dynamic environment we're in. Both utilities, Ameren and ComEd, are now doing multi-year integrated grid planning, and part of that planning is looking at how we meet our environmental goals. That very much factors into what resource adequacy is going to look like in the future as we develop tools to bring more resources online and make it easier for those resources to get online. We also have a distributed generation rebate program. Both utilities offer distributed generation rebates that incent resources to come online. Currently, there's a docket open. There's some default values in the statute, but there's a docket open to reassess those default values and see what value these resources have on the system and bring those online. Along those same lines, for many years, Illinois has had a net metering program, and that continues to compensate resources for situations where distributed generation resource sends electricity back onto the network and the benefits that can provide. Next slide. And then load impacting activities. I want to touch on these a little bit. We have several activities that really factor into, again, on the load side, how the future might develop. Beneficial electrification. Both Ameren and ComEd have programs largely focused on electric vehicles and make-ready infrastructure and setting up a situation where those vehicles can integrate into the system and come online. Obviously, the more electric vehicles we have online, that's going to impact load going forward. So that's a related proceeding. Future of gas is another big one. This is a proceeding the commission has where we're doing some workshops to look at, how can we decarbonize the gas sector going forward in compliance with CEJA's goals. And there has been a lot of discussion within that future of gas proceeding over what are the impacts if we electrify, in particular, on load and our ability to meet that load. So that future of gas proceeding has called upon this resource adequacy proceeding quite a bit, and we've proposed to report back to the future of gas on some of the findings we get from this resource adequacy effort. Finally, the utilities, both ComEd and Ameren, along with the gas utilities, have had robust energy efficiency programs for some time now. And obviously, the more energy efficiency that's out there, the more that impacts load in potentially a positive way, reduces load needs. Next slide. As E3 and Jim have mentioned, all these efforts, it's integral that we work with our regional transmission organization partners, PJM and MISO, and the markets they run as we look at our resource adequacy needs. And the commission has been involved with these processes for quite some time. The commission participates directly, both submitting feedback to the RTOs along with submitting feedback to FERC, who oversees those RTOs. We also participate. There are two regional entities. One is the Organization of PJM States, or OPSI. Illinois participates in the OPSI meetings and activities. Our Commissioner McCabe represents the Commission on OPSI matters, and there's a parallel organization with respect to MISO, a group of states that are all within MISO, and Commissioner Kerrigan is our representative to MISO. So many times we participate with these other states, submitting, for example, joint comments through OPSI or OMS on issues regarding federal markets and things like resource adequacy. And we also have a dedicated staff here that oversees the federal policy program and is dedicated to working on these FERC and RTO issues. And next slide. Final thing I wanted to mention, Brian mentioned the nuclear closure study that we did a few years back. But I also wanted to highlight, this isn't the first time we've done a white paper or a study looking at resource adequacy. Several years ago, back in 2017, we looked at the MISO market in response to a request from the governor to look at resource adequacy issues there. And I put a link here to that white paper if you want to go back and look. Obviously, from between now and 2017, a lot has changed. We've had things like the data center issues increasing in significance. But I think there is some informative information in that study if you want to look back, and put a link to that. that's all I had today, and I want to thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jim. Laura.
Thanks, Jim. We'll just jump right in here on the IEPA piece. If you want to go to the first slide. This first slide is just a quick refresher that IEPA's primary responsibility under CEJA relates to the decarbonization of fossil fuel-fired generators by 2045. And within that, IEPA is overseeing the generators' compliance with those emission step-downs and then the eventual zero-emission mandates. The timelines prioritize EJ and equity-eligible communities and facilities with higher emission rates. And then we're also implementing the pathway that's provided in CEJA for the generators to potentially go beyond any emissions restrictions. IEPA's statutory role in the resource adequacy study that we're talking about today is maybe a little bit more narrow than that of IPA and ICC, generally encompassed within the three general elements that you see here. One, the various data points that IEPA has on generator emissions will go into the reporting on the status of greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We'll be consulting with the other agencies and RTOs on announced facility closures. And then at the back end of this process that was mentioned earlier, we'll be working with the Power Agency to revise the draft report based on the stakeholder comments that we receive, and then filing the final report with the Commission. This is just a refresher of the dates by which facilities under CEJA need to achieve zero carbon emissions, which in many cases will likely result in facility retirement. The private coal and oil-fired units are soonest in 2030. On the municipal coal side, those facilities have a hard stop at the end of 2045, and then there are also interim emissions reductions for those plants. For the private gas units, those are on an overall January 1st, 2045 timeline. Those are prioritized in CEJA, so those with higher emissions rates, and if they're in or near EJ areas, will have shutdown dates prior to the overall 2045 deadline, as well as interim emission reductions. And then both the municipal natural gas and the cogeneration or combined heat and power units will be phased out by 2045. So for IPA, we're tracking and providing the emissions data for over 200 individual units at over 40 facilities statewide. The primary mechanism for this is through annual emissions reporting by the generators. This reporting is already required of any facility that IEPA permits, so it's a process that's well known to the regulated community. We have staff at IEPA that are entirely dedicated to collecting and reviewing this data and assessing compliance with their permits. And then specific to CEJA, there is the first of what will now be an annual report that's due at the end of this month, in which we'll be posting the annual GHG emissions data for the generators that fall under the CEJA requirements. Then some additional data points that we track that are available for the purposes of the resource adequacy study. The decarbonization section of CEJA also sets a baseline emissions figure for each private natural gas unit, and then prohibits those units from exceeding that baseline figure in any rolling 12-month period. And then the facilities are required to report to IEPA if they do have an exceedance. So we've been receiving any notices from generators under those provisions since 2021 when the bill was signed, and that's whether or not they were the result of PJM or MISO requiring the runtime that may have caused the exceedance. And then the last slide here outlines that process that I just described that is at the direction of the RTOs. So there are provisions in CEJA to address protection of supply and reliability. If there's a determination by the RTOs that ongoing operation of a facility is necessary for the grid, PJM and MISO both issue guidance to generators that outlines scenarios in which they would seek to utilize those off-ramp provisions that are provided in CEJA that enable the generators to run beyond an applicable emissions unit. Some example of those scenarios from the RTOs include system restoration purposes that might be following an outage, capacity emergencies, or any testing necessary for a unit to ensure their readiness. And then there's also a process established for those facilities to report the information related to those exception events to IEPA when they occur. And that's all I have, and I'll kick it over to Jim.
Thanks, Laura. And thanks, Jim Zelniak, for the prior slide. So I'm going to dive in here, just a few slides on the IPA pieces, and I've crafted this as targeting them related to RA study items. So first and foremost, an overview of the plans. As I'm sure many of you know, we have two primary plans within the IPA. The electricity procurement plan, this is focused on default service customers, specifically in the Ameren, Illinois, ComEd, and Mid-America utility regions. So it's not all customers, but we do go out and procure block energy, both peak and off-peak, for each utility as required per the plan defines, and a capacity hedge or series of capacity hedges for the Ameren customers. So it really is wholesale electric and capacity for Ameren in that context. And then we have the long-term renewable energy procurement plan, or the long-term plans we also often refer to it as. And this has a series of different components and subcomponents within it. So it preeminently has or defines a rule and requirement, if you will, for procuring utility scale renewables. That's solar, brownfield solar, wind, hydro as well. It also has a substantive section associated with what I'll call collectively as the programs, but these are two specifically statutorily defined programs: the Illinois Shines or Adjustable Block Program and the Illinois Solar for All program. These are solar specific programs for end-use customers. In many instances, they could also relate to community solar projects of different sizes, really subdivided into categories and targeted to specific categories within each of these programs. Then there are two other items. One is the adjacent states procurement requirements. So there's considerations associated with evaluating, considering adjacent state projects in relation to the overall targeted objectives within the long-term plan for Illinois. And lastly, there's the self-direct program. The self-direct program is really a program effectively to kind of highlight and recognize large customer bilateral agreements that they have for renewable energy that they've secured themselves. So this is separate from the first item, which is utility scale procurements that's conducted by the IPA. This is all ultimately to meet our RPS targets and other clean energy targets that we have in the state. And so taken together, plus there's a series of sub items within each of these. For example, our minimum equity standards, and kind of clean energy, additional clean energy standards, and so on that we have embedded within the plan itself. But again, in the context of framing it for the RA study, these are the major items that either directly or indirectly relate to the overall project that we're pursuing here. Both plans are filed with the ICC, ultimately for review and approval before implementation. But the other item that came out at the very beginning of 2024 is the policy study. And the policy studies, these are in this case, a separate study beyond the plans themselves, that in this case were targeted looking at very specific goals and objectives. And the three major goals for this policy study were an evaluation of energy storage, evaluation of offshore wind, a pilot program or project, and also evaluation of support structure used for HVDC or high voltage direct current transmission development, more specifically the Sue Green HVDC project link. So there's some statistics here that we had that are really the foundation or the core statistics within the plan and the evaluation criteria used. But the goal here wasn't necessarily that they were also overlapping with one another. Each were specific and evaluated independently in relation to a legislative request that came through with some of these contexts being kicked around through legislative processes, other discussions that were going on, and it directly relates to the work that we're doing here. As you can see for energy storage, while initially it was focused on a 7.5 gigawatt utility scale procurement or series of procurements for energy storage, plus a 1 gig distributed storage approach. It's since evolved, and we've done subsequent summary reviews looking at some of the cost metrics or some of the cost to customer components of smaller 1 to 3 gigawatts. And as Jim mentioned earlier, there was the energy storage workshop that occurred that some elements of this policy study were used or actually contributed into the discussions that were had earlier this year on those. The other two here, offshore wind, was more or less a targeted look at one specific project with very specific outcomes to see what that opportunity and the cost could be for interconnection with the system. And then HVDC as well. As I said, it was targeted at the Sioux Green HVDC link. It's since been, you could look at additional expansions for HVDC, and it goes to the underpinnings of the use of HVDC in the system as a tool to support enhanced integration of new resources, as well as the transfer of energy long distances cross systems in an efficient fashion. So I won't go into too much detail on these, but what I did is highlight a few of the items in each of the three categories of projects evaluated as it relates to resource adequacy, and a few of them being ensuring flexibility in utility scale projects, explore long-term duration storage. This was both for energy storage, then for offshore wind, expanding the analysis of challenges faced by peer states. So this also goes to both the interconnection as well as the resource capabilities of offshore wind, comprehensive review of the environmental impacts, as well as requiring additional information on offshore interconnection points. That's point of interconnection itself and the site improvements that could be needed for a contract award. And then for HVDC, along similar lines, but requiring additional information on new renewable energy, interconnections for the line, and ensuring unresolved capacity market participation issues are satisfied. So these were all the recommendations. Very, very briefly summarize recommendations for the policy study that was completed. But if you take a step back, looking at the plans that the IPA conducts, as well as in this case, the policy study, you could very directly see the line of association between the RA study and the efforts that we have. So as we do the evaluations and we see where there could be issues or constraints or challenges through the study, there may be different levers that we can pull, some of which may be the procurement plans themselves or information that we've gathered through these policy studies, or others, as you've seen from both Laura and Jim in the different efforts they're undertaking and that their shops can provide into the study process as a whole. And so really it links to the last point here, which is future opportunities. Energy storage is re-highlighted here. You could very likely highlight other items like transmission. We discussed other resource types as the statute itself highlights. Look at green hydrogen or other new and emerging technologies that may be upcoming. But at the end of this, the study results are going to help inform the IPA's process, or in part inform the IPA's process. They can help us re-engineer what our targets are set at, why we're setting them, and so on, as well as what our RPS obligations are, how we're building procurements to support them, and then how those procurements are in turn supporting broader resource adequacy. So that is the end of the presentation components here for the agencies, as well as an overview that E3 provided. What we're going to do here in the last little bit over here, but about the last 25 to 30 minutes, is to dive into three set questions that we issued as part of the agenda for this workshop. What I'd like to do is I'm going to open up to the first question, very briefly read it, and if all of you could queue yourself up by raising your hands if you have a response to it, additional information or feedback you'd like to provide in response to the question itself. We'll go through that. I'm looking to hopefully hold this at about 10 minutes each question. Some might go a little longer, a little shorter, so I'm not going to hold it that hard to that, but at least gives you some sort of framing, and I'll just work through the questions as we go. So question one focuses on the variables and processes that we have, the drivers and things that you may all want to see or believe are the higher priorities. So first, for the preamble, the study focuses on investigating the impact of a broad array of policy and procurement initiatives, and while also analyzing effectively the reliability and the resource adequacy needs with the intent of developing solutions. That's ultimately what we're getting at. So with this effort, there's a multitude of variables that could be considered. There are also a suite of different policy considerations and underlying drivers that could be considered, and each could potentially result in different impacts or results to resource adequacy. So the preeminent question here is, which variables are the highest priority to explore throughout this RA study process? And are there important policies or drivers missing that should shape scenario development? And again, if you could cue yourself up, raising your hand, it's at the bottom of the WebEx view here with a little raise hand feature. All right. I see two hands. First, it looks like Scott Metzger from the Illinois OAG.
Hi, Jim. Thanks. This is Scott Metzger from the Attorney General's office. Yeah, I mean, one of the variables that really springs to mind in light of recent events, especially, is the large load forecasting load forecasting, and specifically driven by large load additions like data centers. I mean, that if you've seen the PJM IMM's recent report about the impact of data center demand specifically on the PJM capacity market, I mean, that it's kind of the story, and getting that right will have a huge impact on kind of the downstream decisions. So, I don't have a specific recommendation in this format for how to deal with it, but that the load forecasting has to be right and the cost allocation has to be right, because that's it drove a tremendous amount of costs in the most recent PJM auction, according to the IMM.
Thanks, Scott. Sharon Midgley from Constellation.
Hi, good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great, thanks. For the Constellation team, I would agree with the previous speaker that the load forecasting assumptions are going to be critical. We probably would need to look at various sensitivities and different, a high load case, expected load case, and maybe a lower adoption case. I think that's going to be a critical driver of the conversation, the output. And then another variable to kind of consider is just assumptions around imports and exports into Illinois. How are you going to consider how Illinois relies on its neighbors or supports its neighbors during different times? And those assumptions could probably produce drastically different outcomes in the study process. And since the study process is going to be used for, potential solutions and fixes, I think we'd want to be really transparent about that as well. So those are just some initial thoughts from our team, but certainly we'll look forward to providing written feedback later in the process too. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. I appreciate that. Next in the queue, I see James Giniak from UCS.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. James Giniak with Union of Concerned Scientists and the Illinois Clean Jobs Coalition. I will just echo the previous two speakers. In a modeling exercise that we did at UCS last year, looking specifically at battery storage needs, the two variables that we felt were most important to look at were different levels of load growth, and then the extent to which Illinois maintains its export status. So similar to the previous two speakers, I would suggest prioritizing those two variables on different levels of load growth and whether Illinois, and to the extent Illinois is exporting energy. Thanks.
Thank you, James. And I saw Scott vote with his hand up, but I believe he put it back down. Anyone else have a question or a comment or response to the question? Okay. Again, these questions will be part of the written responses as well that you can all provide. So if you have further details you'd like to, you'll have that second opportunity. The next question, question 2. So with regards to the RA study process, the process itself is tasked with focusing on, as we discussed a little bit previously, the set of different drivers, building scenarios, and then ultimately evaluating those results to determine what to do next. And while many are important, and we're going to consider as many as we can, we're really interested in hearing from all of you about what you see as some of the most critical drivers. And so we've listed here a number of them, 6 plus kind of the catch-all of any that you may have not described. But which of the following drivers are most critical to explore in the RA modeling scenarios? And if you could also provide a little bit of why. All right, not seeing any hands yet. We can also do is come back to this after the third question that we have here as well. So why don't we do that? Why don't we move forward to the next question, the third one, and then we can come back as you all have a second to consider this. So the third and last question that we've queued up really relates to any blind spots that the study may have. So again, the way that this is all being set up, at least initially, is focusing on the statutory obligations that we have in meeting those end requirements, and focus on investigating the broad array of policy and procurement activities that we have, their potential impacts, resource adequacy, and so on. So the final question that we have is what blind spots or gaps that this study process might otherwise overlook, and what kind of concerns or questions you might have with regards to that they may otherwise not be addressed. Yes, Scott.
Thanks. I decided my question probably fit better here than on the first one. That's why I pulled my hand down last time. But you know, as E3 was going through kind of their process, I just think it's very important that we focus more on the physical resource adequacy needs. So versus maybe the market constructs around resource adequacy. So while the market constructs may be ultimately an input into whether resources get built or not, at the end of the day, the market constructs on the capacity markets don't necessarily result in what is real resource adequacy. So I think Sharon's point about imports, exports, I think all the tie lines matter. And I think what's happening around us in the other states around getting generation built is critically important, and that the cost related to the different market structures is more of an output versus maybe a driver or variable is what I'm trying to make sure we focus on. And in particular, I was concerned about the ELCC construct, because as long as we're doing an 8760 model of matching resources to 8760, the ELCCs actually don't matter except for the financial constructs in the market.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Scott. Any other comments to this question about things that either you see maybe overlooked or gaps in the process? Yes, Sharon.
I'm not sure if it is overlooked, but I just wanted to highlight the importance of the close coordination between the folks doing the study and the utilities and the RTOs, particularly when it comes to the load forecasting. I think the load forecasting is going to be one of the most critical inputs, and that's something that we just really want to make sure that there's alignment and a lot of collaboration on the load forecast. And then I'll also throw out potential demand response and demand flexibility as other things to maybe just kind of add to the list and keep in mind as we go through this process. Thanks.
Thank you, Sharon. Any additional comments from folks? All right, I want to wrap back to the second question, just in case anyone had thoughts, and that's related to which of the following drivers may be most critical to explore in this process and the modeling of the scenarios and why. So these include extreme weather, demand growth, thermal retirements, transmission build and future needs, generation resource diversity, and out-of-state reliance on generation resources. Those are the 6 we put forward. But there's a 7th, which is the catch-all, any other driver that's not described above, and what those could be. Okay. Well, what we'll do is we'll continue along. We're basically at the end here, but what I did want to get to before we ended, there we go, is the next steps here. So the conclusion of what you can expect going forward, things to look for and support also going forward. And the first of those is the release of the stakeholder questions. So these are going to be a suite of questions. Like I said, 3 that we just went through will be part of that set that are looking to solicit information from all of you, whether it be data and information, policies, studies, other analyses done, just your broader thoughts and ideas on the study process that can help inform the front end of this. So that is the inputs, the scenarios, the considerations, all as we're building the scenarios themselves, gathering the data and information, starting to run the analyses. I am targeting the issuance of the questions themselves on 6/17. That's tomorrow. But we will issue an announcement. That announcement both will be on the IPA's website. We're also going to push the announcement out through all of those of you that signed up for the communication or the email communication itself. So if it doesn't come out on the 17th and it comes out on the 18th, you will get that. So please be ready for that. Responses are going to be due in about a month. So 7/14 is our targeted date. I want to make sure you at least have about a month for the responses to ensure that all of that information that gets into or is evaluated by the team for consideration in the process. The agencies are also going to be reaching out to some of even the comments made in the Q&A session here at the end to key stakeholders. The stakeholders are at least going to be the RTOs and utilities. Again, as we go through here, there may be other groups that we find we need to reach out to for further information. Most importantly, at this point, it's data input and the consideration of that data input into the model, qualifying information we may already have, finding information that we don't have but we need to make the model run effectively, and so on. And then we also, as I mentioned at the start, do expect to have future workshops. So at least one likely in the September-ish timeframe. Again, we use that same distribution list for the RA study to let you know that, as well as posting on the website. There may be others as we can go throughout this if we find we need them. And of course, then as we get to the very end with the report issuance, that'll ultimately conclude the process, but that's in December. And I think I saw a comment come through about posting of the materials. This presentation will be posted. It'll be posted likely this afternoon. So that'll go up first. The recording that we currently have will also be posted. That may take just a little bit more time as we gather it and upload it to the system. That's likely somewhere in maybe tomorrow or shortly thereafter. So please check back to the website for that. That effectively ends this. What I did want to do, though, is show you where to go if you have not seen it on our website. Let me pull that up real quick. All right. Here we go. So on the IPA's website, I'll give it a second. It might take a moment on WebEx here to show. All right, Charlie, since I could see your face, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see it? All right, awesome. So this is on the website. If you go out to the IPA's main website here, go under, once it wants to load, electricity procurement. And at the bottom is resource adequacy. This should throw you straight to the RA page. This is the page that we're going to be using to update and post all materials. The materials I just mentioned, that is the presentation as well as the recording itself, are going to be posted under here. Also under here will be where the questions are posted. So as opposed to a sub to the workshop, we're likely going to have an additional line. It'll provide the notes when they're due, but then the questions themselves will also have additional instructions within them. Here is where you can go to look at the or sign up for the distribution list. If you haven't already, this list will constantly be viewed, reviewed before every announcement goes out. So any new folks that come on will be included. And then at the very bottom, we have a brief overview of the process. This is just a different representation of what I had earlier in the presentation. If additional items come up that are key activities, we will add them here. But of course, the main point I'd say to look at would be the central section, which is the workshop information or the announcement that we would issue through that distribution list.
Hey, Jim, this is Jim Zolnarek. I just want to note the commission also has a link for the resource adequacy study, but it really just points to the IPA. We didn't want to have competing sites with different information. So when you go to the commission site, there's a link, but it just points to the IPA site. Thanks.
Thanks, Jim. Great point. And we're going to be doing that a lot throughout this process. So there may be communications that come out that we're going to coordinate with the ICC and IPA teams. So what you should see is by and large the same or similar materials, just communicating out to different audiences. And as Jim mentioned, even our sites are pointing at one another's so that there's just a centralized location, but you can come through it in different means. So that ends this first workshop. Let me stop sharing screen there. So that ends the first workshop. I really do appreciate everyone's participation throughout this. I am definitely looking forward to your participation also going forward, seeing your responses through the questions that we're going to be issuing shortly and going forward. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be more than happy to try to coordinate some of that. Otherwise, we, like I said, look forward to your future participation and we'll be in touch. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.